Shavua Tov, a good vach to you, my holy sisters and brothers. That was a raw but very real recording of a Havdalah a few years ago in Cape Town, South Africa, from the Beit Midrash Morasha congregation. I think that was the Bnei Akiva youth group singing in a new week with Havdalah. That was courtesy of the Jewish Convert YouTube channel. How are you? Did you have a great Shabbos following on the heels of a beautiful and miraculous Hanukkah? We pray you did. Let's get this week started with some awesome Torah. What was that? Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle for Saturday night. Who is going to be with us as we get it going? A new week on this Saturday night. Where is it? Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, Hannah in Mississippi, Susan in London. You must be up late or up early. Welcome, Susan. Susan in Alabama, Andy in Westchester, Aloma Jean Grain. I think that's a new name. Watching from Reed City, Michigan, USA. Hallelujah, kisses and hugs. Donna with us from North Carolina, Alan from Columbia, Maryland, Susan says, grateful to see you, let's learn, amen. Sharon is with us saying Shavua Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey, and Wayne is in Henderson, North Carolina, Gail is in Virginia, Fronas is happy, Bill is with us saying Shabbat Shalom, Jill saying hello from Denver. Over there on the YouTube side, Neil is in Virginia, Lynn is in North Texas, also Norman, Fort Lauderdale on Facebook. Welcome everybody. We got a really interesting daf tonight. Tonight's class is dedicated, a beautiful dedication here from Mary Brown to Yenta and Yosef Braun. For the honor of Yenta and Yosef Braun, may their merit increase thanks to the merit of our learning tonight, dedicated by Mary Brown. And we say amen. Also from Gedala Fenster, and I must say, if you've ever had a chance to listen to Gedala's videos, he teaches Breslov Torah. It's beautiful, stunning. Breslov Hasidus, the teachings of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. He does a great job, and he donated to our annual campaign and dedicated tonight's class to the healing of Yerachmiel Daniel ben Tova Basha. May Yerachmiel Daniel ben Tova Basha have a complete and speedy recovery of body, mind, spirit, anything that may be ailing him. And Gedala, may you be strengthened in your work and your teaching to 120. And we say amen. Where are we holding? We are, wait a minute, that's not right. We are on page 28. Yes, we are on page 28, Chav Ches. Daf Chav Ches of Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We are learning the laws of Passover. We are in chapter 2, and today we're finally completing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 of chapter 2 and beginning our discussion of Mishnah number 2. The Mishnah number 1 was all about the difference between when chametz becomes prohibited for eating and for benefit. Toward the end of that Mishnah, we learned that Rabbi Yehuda said that when it's time to dispose of the chametz, right? So forget about the distinction now between eating and benefit. But when it actually comes time to dispose of the chametz, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be done by burning. Now, to make the clear distinction, earlier in the day, this is on the morning of the 14th of Nisan. Passover begins on the evening, right? So again, days in the Hebrew calendar begin at night. So the Passover is on the 15th of Nisan, which begins that night. The 14th is the morning of that same, solar day. And that morning, when we can still eat the chametz, and we can benefit from it, we can also sell it. So by then, that's the last time when we need to sell it to a non-Jew. Usually it's a pro forma type of sale, and then we can buy it back after Passover. But by selling it, it's no longer in our possession. Any chametz, leavened bread, leavened products, which remains in our possession when we reach the 6th hour of the day, is going to have to be disposed of permanently. Rabbi Yehuda says it needs to be burned. The sages are going to disagree with him. As we've learned before, the sages will say you need to crumble it and scatter it to the wind or into the sea as an alternative to burning. They're certainly okay with burning, but they're not saying it must be burned. Rabbi Yehuda says the chametz must be burned. Now, this dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages is going to go step by step. And if I am able to trace these steps clearly and make this dispute, this Talmudic dispute, sing, as it were, and if that song moves you, then we as a group, as a class, have really made progress. It's going to be great, right? Because if you weren't accustomed to listen to Talmudic argument, you know, and I've been studying Talmudic argument for a long time, but I haven't been teaching it so long, right? I started this Daf Yomi class AT Daily almost a year ago, January 5th of 2020. So I feel like, you know, I've been learning how to teach, and maybe you've been learning how to learn. And if now we can make this argument really clear and kind of sing for us, then we've all taken a good step forward. So let's see if we can really get it. We can grok it. We can sink our teeth into it and enjoy it. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, okay, chametz has to be burned. The requirement of the disposal of chametz that's still in our possession in the 6th hour, in the morning of the 14th of Nisan, the disposal of chametz must be by burning. And the sages are going to disagree. So Rabbi Yehuda needs to prove where his requirement, like he needs to give the source and his argument for why it must be burned. And he's going to try a whole bunch of different strategies for winning his point. First, he's going to say a kal v'chomer argument, usually translated into English as a fortiori sequence, meaning if we're going to take a stringent position with respect to this area of the law, which is like of medium stringency, then with respect to a comparable area of the law, which is itself more stringent, all the more we should take a stringent position on the issue that these two areas have in common. That's a bit general, but now let's get into what he's saying here. So his kal v'chomer goes like this. We're going to learn the requirement to burn chametz on the morning before Passover begins from the requirement to burn nosar. What is nosar? Nosar refers to something quite specific. When the temple was standing in Jerusalem and people brought certain kinds of sacrifices where parts of the sacrifice could be eaten, right? So this would include the peace offerings and the Thanksgiving offerings. The part that could be eaten, either by the priests or even by the person who brings the sacrifice and their friends, the part that could be eaten, as opposed to the part that goes up in smoke on the altar, you did not have an unlimited amount of time to eat it. This is similar actually to the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb or the Paschal goat that is brought for Passover. Just like that, there's a time limit. The part that may be eaten has to be eaten by a certain time. I think it's 2 nights and a day. And after the time limit has passed, off limits, no more eating. At that point, you have to burn it. So, says Rabbi Yehuda, we can learn from nosar, which is not subject to the requirements of it shall not be seen in your homes or in your possession, and it shall not be found in your home. Is that the way it's worded? I just want to make sure. Basically, it's not subject to it shall not be seen and it shall not be found. And it is subject to burning when it's time to dispose of it. Then chametz, which is subject to the prohibitions, it shall not be seen and it shall not be found, right? There shall not be seen chametz in your possession. I think it's in your possession or in your homes, but the Torah says it shall not be seen. Let me just get it so it's right in front of me. I don't want to misspeak or just get it wrong in any way. We're at the bottom of 27b, by the way. which is not subject to the prohibitions, it shall not be seen in your possession, and it shall not be found in your possession, because they're both in possession. Again, Nasar, which is not subject to the prohibitions, it shall not be seen in your possession, and it shall not be found in your possession, must nevertheless be burned when the time comes to dispose of it. Then how much more chametz, leaven, which is prohibited on Passover and is subject to the prohibitions, it shall not be seen in your possession and it shall not be found in your possession. Those are specified directly in the Torah. How much more, since chametz is subject to those more stringent prohibitions, that also it's going to be subject to burning, the more stringent way of disposing of a prohibited item, as opposed to burying or crumbling or scattering. Burning is the more stringent way to get rid of it. The sages who dispute Rabbi Yehuda are going to answer him and say, no, that doesn't work. A kal v'chomer argument for the purposes of establishing a stringency, and which in fact leads to a leniency, is a failed argument. It does not work. What do we mean by that? Say the sages, that if you require, based on your comparison to Nasar, that chametz also has to be burned because it's subject to even more stringent prohibitions than the Nasar, and the Nasar has to be burned, therefore the chametz has to be burned, then what's going to happen when a Jew who is getting rid of his chametz at his house, not in Jerusalem, but wherever he might live, and he doesn't have wood available to make a fire? If you're saying that he must burn his chametz, and he doesn't have wood or other materials to make a fire, then he's not going to dispose of his chametz at all. And your stringency requiring him to burn it is going to lead to a leniency where he's not going to destroy his chametz at all. Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, good point. But I have a better argument for why chametz must be burned. Rather than a kal v'chomer argument based on going from something less stringent to something more stringent, we're going to make a comparison of context. This is going to be called a general gezerah shava argument, not a specific gezerah shava, but basically we're going to compare two laws in the Torah that are similar to each other, and because they're so similar, they should have similar outcomes. So again, he's going to compare to Nasar, the leftover beyond its time of a sacrifice, right after its time limit for eating has expired. Where am I? Okay. Right, comparison of two contexts. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, okay, so Nasar is prohibited for consumption. Chametz is prohibited for consumption. And these are two things that were initially permitted, and then they become prohibited for consumption. And just as the Nasar becomes prohibited for consumption, and then it must be burned, and the chametz becomes prohibited for consumption, and then it must be, therefore, at that point, it must be burned, says Rabbi Yehuda. And the sages say, well, look at the case of the nevela, the carcass of a kosher animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher fashion. It was an animal that was not prohibited in itself. After it was slaughtered in an improper fashion, or it just died of its own, but it wasn't slaughtered with a kosher shechting, a kosher butchering. At that point, it became prohibited for consumption, prohibited for eating, but unlike the chametz, it remains available for benefit. Chametz is prohibited for benefit. I skipped a step. The nevela becomes prohibited for consumption, and just like the chametz becomes prohibited for consumption, but the nevela is not required to be burned. So therefore, we can see that just because it became prohibited for consumption doesn't mean it needs to be burned. And your proof about the chametz fails because just because it became prohibited for eating doesn't mean that it needs to be burned. Rabbi Yehuda says, wait a minute, that's different. Nasar and chametz share the attribute that they are both of them are prohibited for both eating and for benefit. You can't say that of the nevela, the improperly slaughtered animal, or the not slaughtered animal, the carcass of a kosher animal, because it becomes prohibited for eating, but it remains available, permitted. It remains permitted for benefit. We studied that a few days ago, that you have the right to give it to a Noahide or to sell it to a nachri, right, to an idolater, somebody practicing a different religion. So the sages say, okay, but then Rabbi Yehuda, your argument fails because we're going to bring the example of the ox that must be stoned. The ox that must be stoned is an ox who was an innocuous ox, meaning it did not have a record of being dangerous and killing people. But at one point, this particular ox, unexpected, the owner wasn't neglectful, but somehow this ox broke free and killed someone. And so the owner's not going to be punished in the sense that he's going to be, liable himself for a negligent homicide. But the ox needs to be killed. That is the ox that stands to be stoned. It will be stoned. It can't be permitted to live because it killed a human being. Now, the ox that is stoned demonstrates that your argument is no good because the meat, the flesh of the ox that is stoned, that is to be killed by stoning, is prohibited for eating. It's prohibited for benefit. And it does not require burning. So the fact that chametz and nosar both are prohibited for eating and prohibited for benefit, and that nosar requires burning, does not prove that chametz requires burning, because the ox that is stoned does not require burning. So Rabbi Yehuda answers, no. That's different. Why? Because the nosar and the chametz are both prohibited for eating, prohibited for benefit, and if you do eat it, you are punished with charis, right? Charis is excision, death by the hands of the heavenly court, meaning that an earthly court isn't going to issue a capital punishment to you, but this is considered a major transgression in the Torah. And, if you do too many of these, the heavenly court will rule that you're going to lose time in your life. You're going to die an earlier death than you would have otherwise. Can you say the same of the ox that is stoned? The answer is no. There's no penalty in the Torah that if you eat the flesh of the ox that is stoned, you will suffer excision, you'll suffer charis. So therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, we're back to nosar and chametz are the only ones that are prohibited for eating, prohibited for benefit, and if you do eat it, you're subject to charis, and since nosar is burned, therefore, we should have to burn the chametz as well when we dispose of it. The sages say, no, Rabbi Yehuda. And the chalev of the ox that is stoned will prove that your argument fails. The chalev is the forbidden fat, right? So when you're doing a kosher butchering of an animal and you shecht it properly, right? You slaughter it properly in the kosher fashion. Now that's kosher meat and a Jew can eat it. But we don't eat all parts of the animal. If you ever go to a kosher steakhouse, you'll see that there are certain cuts of the steak, of the cow, that are not available for eating because they're not kosher. Part of their thing is that we don't eat the sciatic nerve and what's around it. There's just certain parts of the animals, of the cow, that Jews can't eat. One of those parts is called the chalev. It's the forbidden fats, and we can't eat that. Say the sages to Rabbi Yehuda, when we're looking at the chalev, the forbidden fat of the ox that is stoned, now we come to a piece of that ox that it is forbidden to eat it, forbidden to benefit from it, and if we do eat it, the punishment is charis, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court, just because that's the punishment of any chalev. Anytime you eat the forbidden fats of any animal, and here it's even more forbidden because it's coming from the ox that stands to be stoned for goring a human being. So answers Rabbi Yehuda, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I still am going to carry the day with the following argument. Nosar, like chametz, is prohibited for eating. It's prohibited for benefit. If you do eat it, it's punished by charis. and it's subject to the prohibition, do not leave over. Okay, so nasar, like that's where it comes from, is that it's a part of a sacrifice brought on the altar that is permitted to be eaten by people, either by priests or by priests and others. But you have a time limit in which you can eat it. And once that time limit passes, then you can no longer eat it. Chametz has the same kind of requirement. Once we reach the time of Passover, on the eve of Passover, when you can no longer eat chametz, at that point, do not leave over. You have to remove it from your possession, either by selling it at first, and then when the time comes, burning the rest. So they have that in common. So Rabbi Yehuda says, we have so much in common between chametz and nasar has to be burned for its disposal. Clearly, chametz has to be burned also. And the sages say to Rabbi Yehuda, no. And our proof to you comes from your own ruling, Rabbi Yehuda. Say the sages, the nasar, the leftover meat beyond its time limit has passed, of two particular offerings brought on the altar, the asham talui. So this is an offering that is brought where somebody would have to bring a chatas, a sin offering, for the unwitting violation of a negative commandment, like you can't do work on Shabbos, and you did work by mistake, so then you have to bring a chatas, the sin offering. You become liable to bring it. However, if you're not sure whether you did that work or not, you might have, you might not. It's unclear. You just don't know, but it's definitely possible that you did. So then you bring this other offering called the asham talui. And there's also a bird chatas brought for the same reason, the uncertain transgression of a negative prohibition in the Torah. These offerings are brought because you might need to bring a sin offering, but you're not sure. So just in case you were liable to bring the sin offering, you bring this other offering, this kind of like the suspended sin offering, which gets you off the hook until such a time as you may learn, whether you owed it or not. And you may never learn. And so you're basically bringing this particular offering for uncertainty. Now, when you bring that kind of offering, there is a component of it that is eaten, right? So there's nasar of the asham talui. Unlike a chatas, you don't eat, I don't think you eat part of the chatas, but the asham talui, so that part of it can be eaten. And if that is kept over beyond its time, it would become nasar. And in another ruling elsewhere in the Talmud, the sages who dispute Rabbi Yehuda said, we say the nasar, the asham talui, has to be burned. But you said it can be buried. It doesn't have to be burned. Now that's a nasar, just like the nasar that you're talking about. It might have a different source, but it's nasar, and it's subject to prohibition on eating, prohibition on benefit. If you do eat it, you're subject to kares. And it's subject to the prohibition, do not leave over. It's nasar. You have to finish it by that time limit or it becomes nasar. And in that case, Rabbi Yehuda, say the sages, you said burial was okay. Now you're insisting that burning is necessary. And Rabbi Yehuda was silent. He realized that he had been defeated. And ironically, in that argument, he had been defeated by his own ruling in another dispute on another day. And that is why, of course, the law is, as we've already discussed, it is not necessary to burn chametz. That is typically what is done. It's the preferred method of destroying whatever chametz is left over in our possession come around 11 o'clock in the morning, on the morning before Passover begins. It's better to burn it, but if you don't have wood available, if it's not convenient to burn it, if it's going to be difficult, then you can crumble up that chametz and scatter it in the wind or cast it in the ocean. That's how the law became that way, and not that burning is required, as Rabbi Yehuda held. The later sages, the sages of the Gemara, who are operating and learning and studying these rulings of the Mishnah, when they're learning over there in Babylonia and Bavel, which is part of the Persian Empire, they get a kick out of how this argument, this dispute, was finally resolved in favor of the sages against Rabbi Yehuda, using Rabbi Yehuda's own ruling. And so they make a few kind of colorful Talmudic comments on this, similar to the phrase that we sometimes use in English, hoisted by his own petard, right? They didn't say hoisted by his own petard. What did they say? Hold on. They said, Rav Yosef said, in the dish that the craftsman made, he eats mustard that burns his tongue. Probably sounds better in Aramaic, but that's the same idea, just discussing the irony, the humorous irony of Rabbi Yehuda being defeated by his own argument. Abaye puts it a little bit differently. He says, the shackle maker sits in the shackles that he made, and by his own handiwork, he is repaid. And Rava says, the arrow maker is killed by his own arrows, and by his own handiwork, he is repaid. So if you're ever looking, for the Talmudic way to say that a person, ended up falling into the hole that he himself dug, there you go. The arrow maker is killed by his own arrows, or the shackle maker sits in his own shackles, or in the dish the craftsman made, he eats mustard that burns his tongue. All right. The final discussion on this Mishnah will be, according to the sages, chametz can be disposed of by crumbling and scattering it in the wind or casting in the ocean. And the question that's asked is, okay, well, we get that you can crumble it and scatter it in the wind, but if you're going to cast it in the ocean, do you first have to crumble it, or can you just throw it in the ocean? They go back and forth on that a few times, and they finally conclude that yes, if you're going to throw it into the ocean, you should also crumble it before you cast it on the waters. And that completes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Pesachim. We're going to read Mishnah number 2 and just begin the discussion of it, but we'll continue that in further depth tomorrow. So Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 2, and if you've got comments and questions, it's a good time to put them into the comments now. I'll be coming to that soon, and Nina will pass them to me. The Mishnah number 2 of chapter 2. The Mishnah states the law of chametz that was left over Pesach, right? So there was some chametz that was not destroyed. So chametz of a Gentile over which Pesach has passed is permitted for benefit after Pesach. We would expect that. That's why we sell our chametz that we don't want to destroy to a non-Jew before Passover. After Passover, we buy it back from him. And then we have the use of all of our cereal and all of our bread and all of our sauces that have chametz in them, that we'd rather not just destroy all that stuff. And that's why we do that arrangement of selling everything for $1 and then buying it back for $1 after Passover. However, chametz that was in the possession of a Jew over Pesach is forbidden for benefit after Pesach, for it is stated, leaven shall not be seen to you. That's that requirement, right? Leaven shall not be seen in your possession. So the idea is, if you somehow neglected to either sell or destroy your chametz, your leavened bread and other leavened products before Passover, so then they remained in your possession during Passover. And the point of this Mishnah is that after Passover, when it is generally permitted to eat chametz, the chametz that remained in your possession during Passover becomes prohibited to you. And what it's saying is that any chametz that was owned by a Jew during Passover is prohibited to Jews after Passover. So that's the ruling of this Mishnah. What the Gemara will ask is, well, Who is the Tana of this Mishnah? Who is the rabbi whose view is recorded in this short and quite clear Mishnah? And then it's going to compare the ruling in this Mishnah to a Baraisa, which brings the rulings of three Tanaim, three sages of the Mishnah, who say something similar, but none of them really accords perfectly with what's being said in this Mishnah. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda says in a Baraisa that any chametz, hold on, let's get it here. What is their dispute? In a Baraisa it says, concerning chametz, both before its time and after its time, one transgresses a prohibition on its account, and if it is consumed within its time, one transgresses a prohibition and is subject to the penalty of karis on its account. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying before its time means not obviously chametz is permitted to us, long before Passover begins, but right before Passover begins, that afternoon, right from the 6th hour of the day onward on the 14th of Nisan, it becomes prohibited to us and to eat chametz. And so he says, during that time, it's subject to a prohibition. Meaning, we're not sure. Is it a rabbinic prohibition or is it a biblical prohibition? Rabbi Yehuda is saying it's a biblical prohibition. And also, if you had it during that time before Passover started, the afternoon before Passover starts, then when Passover ends, it remains prohibited to you. And during Passover, if you eat of it, then you become subject to the Torah penalty of karas, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court. Rabbi Shimon says, where am I? Rabbi Shimon says, before its time and after, it is not prohibited. It is not the subject of a prohibition, meaning a biblical prohibition. We all agree it's a rabbinic prohibition. But if you eat it within the time, meaning during Passover, you are subject to karis. And the Bryce is saying that, hold on a second. From the time chametz prohibited for eating. And then the Baraisa continues, and from the time chametz is prohibited for eating, it is prohibited for benefit as well, which seems to be the same as the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yosef Haglili says, chametz is not even forbidden for benefit throughout all the days of Passover. Now, this is definitely not what we've learned before. These rulings are going to be a subject of confusion and of raised eyebrows for the Gemara. The Baraisa seems to be saying that Rabbi Shimon holds that the prohibition to eat chametz kicks in only with the requirement to eat matzah, meaning it's not prohibited the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. It only becomes prohibited once you're required to eat matzah, meaning when Passover starts that night, right, when the 15th of Nisan comes in. But so according to Rabbi Shimon, at least on a biblical level, chametz is not prohibited on the afternoon. Now, we learned that the reason chametz becomes prohibited on the afternoon is that the Torah says, when you slaughter the paschal offering, the paschal lamb, the korban Pesach, right? The Pesach, meaning it's a lamb or a goat that you slaughtered on the afternoon of the 14th when the temple is standing. We don't do that now and haven't for 2,000 years. But that afternoon, when you slaughter the Pesach offering, at that point, the Torah says it shall not be slaughtered over chametz. So the sages derived that as a Torah matter, you are prohibited to eat chametz that afternoon. And Rabbi Shimon is disagreeing with that. Why would he disagree with that? But Rabbi Shimon brings an interesting question. He says, we have a Pesach Sheni. There were people who are not permitted to eat the paschal offering. They're not permitted to participate in the Korban Pesach, the paschal sacrifice, the goat or the lamb. Why? Because they're not in Jerusalem, they're away, they're somewhere else, or they're there, but they're tameh, they're in a state of ritual impurity, and for them, they can't eat of the Korban Pesach. And it was for people in that situation who asked Moses in the desert, we were sent on an errand to bury a dead body. We came back. Now we're tameh. We're going to be tameh for 7 days. So how come, because we were doing a good deed, now we can't participate in eating the Pesach, in eating the Passover offering? And Moses brought their question to God, and God said they have spoken correctly. For those people who were away on a legitimate errand or who became tameh because of it, there's going to be a second Passover. There is a Passover, a Pesach Sheni, a second Passover. It's actually still observed in a minor way. That's 30 days later when those people get that opportunity to participate in the Paschal offering. So ask Rabbi Shimon, well, for those people, they're not slaughtering a Pesach. They're not part of slaughtering the Pesach. For them, but they are still required to eat matzah during Passover. So for them, are they prohibited to eat chametz on the afternoon of the 14th? Or does their prohibition on eating chametz only begin that evening when the requirement to eat matzah, the festival of matzah, begins for them? That's the question Rabbi Shimon has asked, and we'll continue discussing that tomorrow. It's just worth noting that along with that question, the Gemara notes that person, right, who is not allowed to participate when the temple is standing in eating the Paschal offering, the meat of the Paschal offering, but he is obligated to eat matzah during Passover. That obligation to eat matzah on Passover not only extends to the person who doesn't qualify to eat the Paschal offering because he became tameh, he became ritually impure by burying a dead body, for example, or because he just wasn't in Jerusalem at that time. That requirement to eat matzah also extends to the uncircumcised Jew and to the stranger. Who are they? The uncircumcised Jew is not, it's not a Jew who just, he neglected, his parents neglected to circumcise him. It's actually somebody who's legitimately uncircumcised because for some reason in that family, there was a boy before him who they circumcised and tragically died from the procedure. Rarest possible event, but it could happen. And if it did happen and the parents then became afraid, I think might even had to try it twice. So, that they had earlier male siblings that they circumcised and then they reacted badly to the procedure, sort of like that 1 in millions type of event, with like a bad reaction to a vaccine type of thing. Then the parents are not going to circumcise this boy. So it can be a Jew brought up in the faith, but legitimately uncircumcised. And it says in the Torah that the uncircumcised shall not participate in the Paschal offering. So he's legitimately uncircumcised. I think he's still not allowed to participate in the Paschal offering, but he is obligated to eat matzah. And then the stranger, that's the secular Jew. That's the Jew who's gone, wandered off the path of Judaism. And he was born a Jew, but he's, now subscribed to other religions. He might even be engaged in avodah zarah, in idolatry. Nevertheless, every Jew, no matter what his life looks like, no matter what his beliefs are, no matter what he's gotten into, philosophically and theologically, even idolatry, which is such a major sin, nevertheless, he's obligated to eat matzah on Passover. And that obligation to eat matzah on Passover goes along with matzah, bitter herbs, and recounting the tale of the Exodus. Right? So in other words, going to a Seder. Very interesting and a little bit unexpected side note of Rabbi Shimon's argument that there is not a prohibition, a biblical prohibition to eat chametz in the afternoon of the 14th. But that argument is unresolved at this point, and we'll continue with that with God's help tomorrow. All right, let's see about questions and comments. I've just one question. Why not give it to the poor? I assume you're talking here about the chametz. You can give it to the poor. Wait a minute. Let me sign in here. Maybe there's more questions. It's weird. Sign me out. Okay. Come on, Google. Okay, yeah, there's two questions. So Sheila's asking, why not give it to the poor? So it makes sense that you would want to give things that you can't eat to the poor. Now, if you can't eat it because you're a Jew, you can't give it to a Jew who happens to be poor, even though he's hungry. There's going to be relief organizations, especially around holidays, to feed poor Jews so that they shouldn't go hungry. But if it's prohibited for you, it's prohibited for him. But maybe you're asking, why not give it to the poor who is not Jewish? And you could certainly do that before its time has passed, right? When it's still in your control. So you could sell it to a non-Jew, or you could give it away to the poor. You could do whatever you want with it. But once its time has passed, then and that's why we only leave a little bit over to destroy at that point, just so that we can participate in the mitzvah, the commandment, to destroy our chametz, right? To dispose of our chametz. And as we've learned, it doesn't have to be burned, though that is preferable. And that's why on that morning at around 11 a.m., when Passover begins that night, traditionally we will make a little bonfire and dispose of some chametz in it. But it's really just kind of symbolic. It's a symbolic destruction. Most of it we've already sold to a non-Jew because we want it back after Passover begins. But the mitzvah of feeding the poor, that's always in effect and is actually one of the most important and highest values in Judaism. So, I'll just mention here that Nina and I have a Meiser account, right? Yes?
There's 3 questions, right?
Yeah, no, I got, they come in. I got them in. Thanks. We have a Meiser account, right? So this is the correct way to live according to Torah Judaism. And this would be, it's not commanded for Noahides, but I don't think. But it's certainly, I know it's kept. I know that this principle is kept in other religions as well, and that is that you tithe and you tithe properly. So all our income that comes into us, we set 10% aside of it right away. Right? It just goes into a separate account, and then it's very simple. Like as soon as money comes in, 10% goes into the charity account. Now, the charity account is going to be given to certain kinds of things. Like if you donate to a politician because it's a cause you believe in, that's not Meiser money, right? But Meiser tithe money, where's it going to go? Feeding people and educating people, clothing people and sheltering people, right? Education is part of that, right? So if you're giving to causes that promote Torah education, then that definitely is a Meiser cause. But just as important, obviously, is feeding people, clothing people, sheltering people, taking care of the poor. It's such an important value. But, feeding their soul, feeding their heart, feeding their spirit in Judaism is considered just as important. So if you're thinking about where to send some of your Meiser, some of your tithe, your charity, we are in our annual campaign. We're approaching the 2/3 point, and we're not at the 2/3 point of our annual campaign. So donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Enable us to keep sharing Torah, the light of Jewish wisdom, with the world in the coming year. Nino's putting the link there in the comments, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. But giving to the poor, obviously, hugely important, whether for food, shelter, clothes, etc. Sharon asks, if it was in a Jew's possession but was declared ownerless before and after burning, is it still considered in a Jew's possession? So I think what you're asking is a great question, right? So at the time that we search for chametz on the night of the 14th, so that's 24 hours before Passover begins, and again when it comes time to destroy the chametz, we make this declaration. Any chametz that remained in my possession by mistake, because I searched for it or I didn't find it. And then at the time of disposal, I searched for it, I didn't find it, and I wasn't able to dispose of it. But just in case I made a mistake and some of it remained in my possession, that chametz I declare ownerless. Like just stuff found in the street. It's not mine, it's ownerless. And I think what you're asking is, and so then after Passover, you find out that there was some of this chametz that you missed. It was in your house. You declared it ownerless, but it sat in your house all through Passover. What do you do with it now? I'm not sure. We should look that up. My impression, I said, I'm not sure. I could be wrong. My impression is you'd have to get rid of it then. Because even though you declared it ownerless, it did sit in your house. Your intention was to get rid of it. You should have gotten rid of it. It was an accident that you didn't get rid of it. But now that you find it, you probably should get rid of it. But I'm not sure. I could be wrong. And final question, Sheila asks, what does leaven represent? So we've mentioned this a couple times, probably a couple weeks ago. So leaven, right, it's bread that rose or other kinds of grain products that had a possibility of rising when they became moist and encountered heat, even if yeast wasn't involved. But the idea, so why does chametz have to be removed from our possession? Why does God decree that? So in part, we don't know. It's one of those things, it's a hook, the kind of laws that are not rational. It's not a logical thing, like a society needs to outlaw murder, or that society can't exist. How come Jews can't eat, puffy bread on Passover? It's really just because God said so. Now God says, so you shall remember the exodus from Egypt when you fled in haste and there was not time for the bread to rise, etc. This is the bread of affliction. We say that at our Passover Seders. This is the bread of the poor. It's poor man's bread, right? It's not. And so that bread is associated with humility. And so on a more spiritual and symbolic level, bread that rises is puffy, right? It's puffy. And what is it puffed with? Air, right? What makes it big? Not substance, but air. And so on that spiritual level, leaven represents arrogance, right? Leaven represents the attitude that it's all about me. Not how can I be of service to God? How can I be of service to God by being of service to God's creatures? But me. So leaven does come to represent the arrogance of the me first movement, as it were. Okay. Nina sent me one more question and then we got to go. My contract says known and unknown chametz. Wouldn't that cover it? Right. Well, you declare known and unknown chametz ownerless. You're saying the contract that you make with your rabbi when you sell it. Oh, I see what you're saying. Rochelle is saying that when we sell it, or sometimes the rabbi sells it for us, or we make an arrangement and we say, okay, I'm selling you all of my chametz that I've removed from my kitchen and put in my garage with partitions around it. So I'm selling you all the chametz to this non-Jew that is in my possession, whether known or unknown. Aha. So then when you buy it back from the non-Jew after Passover, you would be buying back the known and the unknown. So I guess it was covered even though you declared it ownerless, but you also sold even before you declared ownerless, whatever was left over, you sold what was known and unknown. So if you had that arrangement with the non-Jew with whom you made the deal, then when you discover some of it later after Passover, I guess it would be permitted. And Lynn said, what was this? Good point about those at Pesach Sheni. They don't have to eliminate chametz while eating the matzah, herbs, and lamb. Right. Well, they don't eat the lamb. Are they required? Well, we don't know. We haven't resolved the question of the people. They're not eating the lamb, right? The people who are not qualified when the temple is standing to participate in the Korban Pesach because they're tameh or because they're away. So they're not going to participate in the lamb. They're not going to be allowed to have chametz in their possession. The real question is simply, when does the prohibition on having chametz kick in, right? Is it in the morning, or can they actually have it during the afternoon since they're not going to slaughter the Korban Pesach? We'll continue that discussion with God's help tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great evening. You've done a good thing by starting off your week, learning some beautiful Torah. And if that first part of the class, understanding how Rabbi Yehuda tried all these different arguments to convince the sages that chametz needed to be burned, and the sages defeated each of his arguments, if I was able to make that clear and it was clear to you, then we as a class have progressed in a beautiful way. Yasher Koach, may you be strengthened to keep learning and keep understanding more and able to process more and deeper and more complex Talmudic arguments to 120 years of age. All the best.